I think it's about high time that we went back to basics. That's right folks, hello and thank you for joining me for this week's video. We're really going to be stripping things back today, going right back to basics. I'm going to be taking you through my kind of mini painting 101. These are all the very simple basic things that you need to know to get started with painting miniatures, in my opinion, avoiding some of the more advanced stuff that I think, is maybe best just left until you've been at it a few months. If you're an experienced painter, then I hope that you might still find this video useful anyway, as it will sort of just remind you of some stuff and maybe give you pause for thought to just track back over a few things and refresh yourself on some stuff. But either way, I think it's going to be a lot of fun, so let's get into it. Okay, the first thing I want to talk about is preparing miniatures before we paint them. Usually we're going to be working with plastic miniatures and they're going to come on these frames called sprues. Sprues are what connect all of the different components together. In order to get the miniature off of that sprue, we're going to need to get ourselves a pair of snips. Electronics cutters, side cutters, precision cutters, they go by a few different names. You can find them on Amazon, they're nice and cheap. Give them a go, they're going to make your life a lot easier. Next up, you're going to notice that there's all these little mould lines on all of the components, and you're not really going to want those in your finished piece. They're going to kind of look a little bit crummy, so we like to remove those by scraping them gently with the side of a sharp hobby knife. I would say always get a hobby knife that has the removable type blades that you can replace. Tends to be a lot cheaper in the long run. You can usually pick up 5 of these X-Acto style blades for about £1. And of course we are going to be assembling these miniatures, so there are a couple of different types of glue that we commonly use for this. Plastic glue, which forms a permanent bond on plastics, and super glue, which is more of a removable bond, with a bit of brute force you can snap it. But I also just want to give an honourable mention here to Super Glue Activator, which is an aerosol that makes super glue go hard instantly. I personally consider it an essential because there's a lot of times where you just don't want to be having to hold a piece for ages. Okay, next up I want to have a chat with you about paints and brushes, the basic materials of hobbying. First of all, I'm going to talk about paints, and I've kind of split these into 2 categories. The 2 categories that I've chosen are the more sort of satin finish hobby paints and the more matte finish hobby paints. And because I think that that's quite an important distinction and difference, and a choice that you may want to make fairly early on as to what you want the majority of your paints to look like. A lot of people will fall naturally into Games Workshop's Citadel paints because they are by far the most popular brand available, but they are a satin finish paint, and for certain things like cloth and hair and other textures that you're going to be painting on your miniatures, satin paints can sometimes look a little plasticky or a little unrealistic. So it is usually good to have a mix of matte and satin paints, but some people would just prefer one over the other. I definitely have more of a leaning towards matte. So the main brands that I sort of would say are worth looking at, or that I think are consistently good, or that are just very available and popular, would be Games Workshop and Vallejo for your more satin paints, and then Reaper Master Series and Scale 75 for your more matte paints. Should be noted that Scale 75 have a little bit of a different consistency, and they take a little bit more getting used to against other paints. For brushes, the basic division is just whether you want to go with a more expensive sable brush or a cheaper synthetic brush for the majority of your work. I personally don't really subscribe to the belief that you need a ton of different sizes of brush. I use a sable size 3 brush for everything, but some people like to have a collection of different size synthetic brushes. There is a bit of a myth that you need really tiny fine pointed brushes in order to be able to do detail work. Actually, this is untrue. The point on a size 2 or a size 3 is actually a lot finer, and you can access much greater detail with those slightly larger brushes. The difference is that you are going to have to learn the manual dexterity just to ride the very tip of that brush, and that's going to take you a little bit longer to develop as a skill. So I would recommend starting out with a size 2 or a size 3 of a good quality sable brush, or maybe a small collection of synthetic brushes. We are then also going to be using a technique called dry brushing quite a bit when we paint miniatures, and for this, instead of spending money on expensive purpose-made dry brushes, I personally think that the best compromise is to use cheap makeup brushes. These work fantastically, but the really nice bonus with them is that if you wreck them, they only cost £1 or £2, so you're not going to mind replacing them. The next thing we need to talk about now is definitely undercoating. This is the most important prep stage of the miniature, I would say. We have everything built and assembled, all of the pre-prep is done, we now need to start getting some paint on it. There are a couple of popular ways to go about this. Using rattle can sprays is a very widespread and popular method. However, personally, I'm not actually a huge fan of it. It's very easy to fill in detail with rattle cans because of the high pressure that they spray at. It's very easy to make a lot of mistakes that can actually ruin your miniatures. They're also very heavily affected by the environment, by the conditions, if there's a lot of wind outside, because of course you do have to spray with them outside. So I like to show people a method when they first start of just undercoating with a brush, and this just involves taking a really good high pigment black paint. Now I will say something like Games Workshop's Abaddon Black does not work very well for this, and if that is the black paint that you've got, I'm very, very sorry in advance. Something like Scale 75 Matte Black, something like Reaper Master Series Solid Black or Dragon Black, these are really, really high coverage blacks, and they can afford to be thinned enough that you can put them on as a primer with a brush and they won't fill in too much detail. Now, if you do happen to own an airbrush and you're one of the very lucky few, I actually think that airbrush priming is by far the best way that you can prepare your miniatures. However, that said, I do understand that airbrushes are a very, very expensive setup and that not everybody is going to have one. But if you are getting into the hobby through a group of other friends who are also into the hobby, you could consider asking around your friends if any of them own an airbrush and would be willing to prime some of your miniatures for you. This gives the best balance of keeping all of that detail nice and super crisp. It's quick, it's cheap, it's very, very effective. Okay, let's have a chat about base coating. This is the basic process of just applying flat colours to the surface of our miniature. So when we're base coating something, we're really not looking for lots of texture and detail and all of these flashy effects. All of that really comes later. What we're looking for initially is just to get good, solid, consistent colour onto all of the main surfaces of the miniature. What this tends to involve is building up multiple thin coats until we reach full opacity and we've got a really nice, even, flat base coat. This is super, super important, and I do implore you, do not be tempted to slap on one thick coat or maybe two thick coats to try and get that coverage quickly. It is the one area where taking your time is really, really worth it, and I say that as someone who really struggles to take his time. The next thing I want to talk to you about now is shading. Shading is the process of applying depth into the recesses of a miniature, usually using a dark wash or an ink. There are a number of different products that can do this. Army Painter's Quick Shades, Games Workshop's Shade line. There are also various different types of inks, but the process is always essentially the same thing. You get it to the consistency that you want it, and then you apply it liberally over your base coat, and it will sink into all of the recess detail, leaving the surfaces a little bit cleaner, closer to their original colour, and creating a sense of depth. It is worth noting that there are of course other ways to shade as well, but a lot of them are quite advanced techniques. Something that some people do however is instead of applying a shade, they start base coating with the shade colour and they build up to the mid-tone as they're progressing. This produces more of a kind of old school look to the miniature, but it's a look that I do really, really enjoy, and I still employ it myself on occasion. So it is worth considering maybe when you start base coating your miniature, whether you want to use washes to shade the area or whether you want to start off dark and work up through your mid-tone and into your lighter tone. Other than that consideration, washes are definitely the way to go. Now, highlighting is a process of, as you might imagine, applying lighter colours than your base coats to the miniature in order to make it look like it's lit. There are a number of different ways to achieve this, the easiest of which is probably layer highlighting, where you just build lighter colours on top of your base colour towards the areas that are in the light, leaving the areas that are in the shadow to look darker. However, GW have very much popularised a method of highlighting called edge highlighting, and these days it tends to be something that you're going to want to learn because you're going to see a lot of miniatures painted with this look, and if you ever want to emulate them, you'll need to understand this technique. Edge highlighting is just placing very, very thin lines around the extremities of a shape on the miniature in order to make it look lit at the edges. It's not a realistic effect, but it is an effect that a lot of people find really cool, and I like to blend it with layer highlighting and other sort of different techniques to produce something that is more my look overall. It would also be remiss to do a section on highlighting without talking about dry brushing. However, I would say do be careful with dry brushing because it is a very, very easy technique, and it is something that you can accidentally lean on a little bit too much when you first start painting, and it can start to give you that sort of new painter look to your miniatures, which is probably something you'll want to avoid. The process of dry brushing is dead simple. You put paint onto a flat brush. As I mentioned earlier, I use makeup brushes. You rub the majority of that paint off so that there's just a very dry little dusting of paint left on the brush, and then you whip it across the detail of a miniature, and it's going to pick up on all of those raised edges and look really, really nice. The final section in our Painting 101 video is going to be talking about basing. There are a number of different materials that we can apply to the bases of our miniatures in order to make them look fantastic and finished and super, super cool. Among these, you will probably very quickly encounter texture paints from Games Workshop, and these are absolutely brilliant. They are essentially paint mixed with different roughnesses of aggregate texture in order to give them different looks. They go on in one coat, and as they dry, they start to look like the basis of a battlefield. You can then add a bunch of other stuff over them, as I often like to, but they're a brilliant and simple way to get something on your base to get it looking nice. We also quite often like to glue sand or modelling flock and things like that to the bases of our miniatures to simulate texture. Personally, I'm a huge fan of Rival Crafts coloured sands. They are absolutely brilliant for not needing to do any additional processes. You just glue that sand to the base and it already looks cool because it's pre-coloured. However, a lot of people just glue plain sand to the base and then they'll paint that in, and that will also look fantastic. There are a number of options available to you when it comes to sand. A bit of PVA or super glue will get it fixed to the base super easy. The final basing material that I personally really love is tufts. Tufts are little bits of synthetic grass that are designed to, well, look like tufts of grass when you fix them to your base. They're usually self-adhesive, which makes installing them really simple. They come on sheets like this, and all you have to do is pick one off with a pair of tweezers, plump it down where you want it on the base, and it's done. Okay, so that wraps up my Miniature Painting 101. Those are all the things that I think you need to have some sort of awareness of in order to kind of get on with your first steps in miniature painting. Now, you'll notice very much that I did not go into super detail on any of those categories, and I left you free to explore them. I want you to find your own way as a hobbyist. I don't want you to ever feel that anything that I do is what you should be doing. So I want you to always be free to explore and to do your own thing in the hobby. Find your own way. Choose the materials that work best for you. With that said, I will include a few links in the description of this video to some of the major things that I really like, that I think are brilliant. Some of the things that I think you shouldn't miss or shouldn't go without because they're just really cool. So, seeing as we're all done with that now, please, if you did like the video, make sure you hit that thumbs up button to let me know that you liked it. That would mean the world to me. And of course, if you want to see more and you want to keep up to date on what I'm doing, make sure that you subscribe and enable notifications. I do also have a Patreon. If you're interested in supporting the channel and allowing me to continue making this content, you can check that out with a link in the description. Tiers start from just $1 a month. I think it's about high time that I got out of here now, but thank you so much for joining me for this one. It's been really fun to make a Miniature Painting 101 video, and it's something I've been wanting to do for a long time. I hope you enjoyed it and found it informative, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching, everyone.